Nelson's pillar was a large granite column capped by a statue of Horatio Nelson, built in the centre of what was then Sackville Street in Dublin, Ireland. Completed in 1809 when Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, it survived until March 1966, when it was severely damaged by explosives planted by Irish republicans. Its remnants were later destroyed by the Irish Army. The decision to build the monument was taken by Dublin Corporation in the euphoria following Nelson's victory at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. The original design by William Wilkins was greatly modified by Francis Johnston, on grounds of cost. The statue was sculpted by Thomas Kirk. From its opening on 29 October 1809, the pillar was a popular tourist attraction, but provoked aesthetic and political controversy from the outset. A prominent city centre monument honouring an Englishman rankled as nationalist sentiment grew, and throughout the 19th century the word calls for it to be removed, or replaced with a memorial to an Irish hero. Parts of central Dublin were destroyed during the 1916 Easter Rising, but although it was near the rebels' headquarters, the pillar remained unscathed. It remained in the city as Ireland became an independent free state in 1922, and a republic in 1949. The chief legal barrier to its removal was the trust created at the pillar's inception, the terms of which gave the trustees a duty in perpetuity to preserve the monument. Successive Irish governments failed to deliver legislation overriding the trust. Although influential literary figures such as James Joyce, W. B. Yeats and Oliver Street, John Gogarty defended the pillar on historical and cultural grounds, pressure for its removal intensified in the years preceding the 50th anniversary of the Rising, and its sudden demise was, on the whole, well received by the public. Although it was widely believed that the action was the work of the Irish Republican Army, the police were unable to identify any of those responsible. After years of debate and numerous proposals, the site was occupied in 2003 by the Spire of Dublin, a slim needle-like structure rising almost 3 times the height of the pillar. In 2000, a former Republican activist gave a radio interview in which he admitted planting the explosives in 1966, but after questioning him the police decided not to take action. Relics of the pillar are found in Dublin museums and appear as decorative stonework elsewhere, and its memory is preserved in numerous works of Irish literature. Background: Sackville Street and Blakeney. The redevelopment of Dublin north of the River Liffey began in the early 18th century, largely through the enterprise of the property speculator Luke Gardner. His best-known work was the transformation in the 1740s of a narrow lane called Drogheda Street, which he demolished and turned into a broad thoroughfare lined with large and imposing town houses. He renamed it Sackville Street, in honour of Lionel Sackville, 1st Duke of Dorset, who served as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland from 1731 to 1737 and from 1751 to 1755. After Gardner's death in 1755, Dublin's growth continued, with many fine public buildings and grand squares, the city's status magnified by the presence of the Parliament of Ireland for 6 months of the year. The Acts of Union of 1800, which united Ireland and Great Britain under a single Westminster polity, ended the Irish Parliament and presaged a period of decline for the city. The historian Tristram Hunt writes, capital's dynamism vanished, absenteeism returned and the big houses lost the patrons. The first monument in Sackville Street was built in 1759 in the location where the Nelson pillar would eventually stand. The subject was William Blakeney, 1st Baron Blakeney, a Limerick-born army officer whose career extended over more than 60 years and ended with his surrender to the French after the Siege of Minorca in 1756. A brass statue sculpted by John Van Nost the Younger was unveiled on St. Patrick's Day, the 17th of March 1759. Donald Fallon, in his History of the Pillar, states that almost from its inception the Blakeney statue was a target for vandalism. Its fate is uncertain. Fallon records that it might have been melted down for cannon, but it had certainly been removed by 1805. Trafalgar on the 21st of October 1805. A Royal Naval fleet commanded by Vice Admiral Lord Nelson defeated the combined fleets of the French and Spanish navies in the Battle of Trafalgar. At the height of the battle, Nelson was mortally wounded on board his flagship, HMS Victory. By the time he died later that day, victory was assured. Nelson had been hailed in Dublin 7 years earlier, after the Battle of the Nile, as defender of the Harp and Crown, the respective symbols of Ireland and Britain. When news of Trafalgar reached the city on the 8th of November, there were similar scenes of patriotic celebration, together with a desire that the fallen hero should be commemorated. The mercantile classes had particular reason to be grateful for a victory that restored the freedom of the high seas and removed the threat of a French invasion. Many of the city's population had relatives who had been involved in the battle. Up to one-third of the sailors in Nelson's fleet were from Ireland, including around 400 from Dublin itself. In his short account of the Pillar, Dennis Kennedy considers that Nelson would have been regarded in the city as a hero, not just among the Protestant ascendancy but by many Catholics among the rising middle and professional classes. The first step towards a permanent memorial to Nelson was taken on the 18th of November 1805 by the city alderman, who, after sending a message of congratulation to King George III, agreed that the erection of a statue would form a suitable tribute to Nelson's memory. On the 28th of November, after a public meeting had supported this sentiment, a Nelson Committee was established, chaired by the Lord Mayor. It contained 4 of the city's Westminster MPs, alongside other city notables including Arthur Guinness, the son of the brewery founder. The committee's initial tasks were to decide precisely what form the monument should take and where it should be put. They had also to raise the funds to pay for it. Inception, design and construction. At its first meeting, the Nelson Committee established a public subscription, and early in 1806 invited artists and architects to submit design proposals for a monument. No specifications were provided, but the contemporary European vogue in commemorative architecture was for the classical form, typified by Trajan's column in Rome. Monumental columns, or pillars of victory, were uncommon in Ireland at the time. The Cumberland column in Birr, County Offaly, erected in 1747, was a rare exception. For the entries submitted, the Nelson Committee's choice was that of a young English architect, William Wilkins, then in the early stages of a distinguished career. Wilkins's proposals envisaged a tall Doric column on a plinth, surmounted by a sculpted Roman galley. The choice of the Sackville Street site was not unanimous. The Wide Streets commissioners were worried about traffic congestion, and argued for a riverside location visible from the sea. Another suggestion was for a seaside position, perhaps Southhead at the entrance to Dublin Bay. A recent presence of the Blakeney statue in Sackville Street, and a desire to arrest the street's decline in the post-parliamentary years, were factors that may have influenced the final selection of that site, which Kennedy says was the preferred choice of the Lord Lieutenant. By mid-1807, fundraising was proving difficult. Sums raised at that point were well short of the likely cost of erecting Wilkins's column. The committee informed the architect with regret that means were not placed in the hands to enable them to gratify him, as well as themselves, by executing his design precisely as he had given it. They employed Francis Johnston, architect to the City Board of Works, to make cost-cutting adjustments to Wilkins's scheme. Johnston simplified the design, substituting a large functional blocky pedestal for Wilkins's delicate plinth, and replacing the proposed galley with a statue of Nelson. Thomas Kirk, a sculptor from Cork, was commissioned to provide the statue, to be fashioned from Portland stone. By December 1807 the fund stood at £3,827, far short of the estimated £6,500 required to finance the project. Nevertheless, by the beginning of 1808 the committee felt confident enough to begin the work, and organized the laying of the foundation stone. This ceremony took place on the 15th of February 1808, the day following the anniversary of Nelson's victory at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent in 1797, amid much pomp, in the presence of the new Lord Lieutenant, the Duke of Richmond, along with various civic dignitaries and city notables. A memorial plaque eulogizing Nelson's Trafalgar victory was attached to the stone. The committee continued to raise money as construction proceeded. When the project was complete in the autumn of 1809, costs totaled £6,856. The contributions had reached £7,138, providing the committee with a surplus of £282. When finished, the monument, complete with its statue, rose to a height of 134 feet. The four sides of the pedestal were engraved with the names and dates of Nelson's greatest victories. A spiral stairway of 168 steps ascended the hollow interior of the column, to a viewing platform immediately beneath the statue. According to the committee's published report, 22,090 cubic feet of black limestone and 7,310 cubic feet of granite had been used to build the column and its pedestal. The pillar opened to the public on the 21st of October 1809, on the 4th anniversary of the Battle of Trafalgar, for 10 pre-decimal pence. Visitors could climb to a viewing platform just below the statue, and enjoy what an early report describes as a superb panoramic view of the city, the country and the fine bay. History 1809 to 1966. The pillar quickly became a popular tourist attraction. Kennedy writes that, for the next 157 years its ascent was a must on every visitor's list. Yet from the beginning there were criticisms, on both political and aesthetic grounds. The September 1809 issue of the Irish Monthly magazine, edited by the revolution-minded Walter Watty Cox, reported that our independence has been wrested from us, not by the arms of France but by the gold of England. The statue of Nelson records the glory of a mistress and the transformation of our Senate into a discount office. In an early history of the city of Dublin, the writers express awe at the scale of the monument, but are critical of several of its features. Its proportions are described as ponderous, the pedestal as unsightly, and the column itself as clumsy. However, the Hibernian magazine thought the statue was a good likeness of its subject, and that the pillar's position in the center of the wide street gave the eye a focal point in what was otherwise wastes of pavements. By 1830, rising nationalist sentiment in Ireland made it likely that the pillar was the ascendancy's last hurrah. Kennedy observes that it probably could not have been built at any later date. Nevertheless, the monument often attracted favorable comment from visitors. In 1842, to the writer William Makepeace Thackeray noted Nelson upon a stone pillar in the middle of the exceedingly broad and handsome Sackville Street. The post office is on his right hand, and on his left, Gresham's and the Imperial Hotel. A few years later, the monument was a source of pride to some citizens, who dubbed it Dublin's glory, when Queen Victoria visited the city in 1849. Between 1840 and 1843, Nelson's column was erected in London's Trafalgar Square. With an overall height of 170 feet, it was taller than its Dublin equivalent and, at £47,000, much more costly to erect. It has no internal staircase or viewing platform. The London column was the subject of an attack during the Fenian Dynamite campaign in May 1884, when a quantity of explosives was placed at its base but failed to detonate. In 1853, the Queen attended the Dublin Great Industrial Exhibition, where a city plan was displayed that envisaged the removal of the pillar. This proved impossible, as since 1811 legal responsibility for the pillar had been vested in a trust, under the terms of which the trustees were required to embellish and uphold the monument in perpetuation of the object for which it was subscribed. Any action to remove or reside the pillar or replace the statue required the passage of an Act of Parliament in London. Dublin Corporation had no authority in the matter. No action followed the city plan suggestion, but the following years saw regular attempts to remove the monument. A proposal was made in 1876 by Alderman Peter McSweeney, a former Lord Mayor, to replace the unsightly structure with a memorial to the recently deceased Sir John Gray, who had done much to provide Dublin with a clean water supply. The corporation was unable to advance this idea. In 1882, the Moore Street Market and Dublin City Improvement Act was passed by the Westminster Parliament, overriding the trust and giving the corporation authority to reside the pillar, but subject to a strict timetable, within which the city authorities found it impossible to act. The act lapsed and the pillar remained. A similar attempt, with the same result, was made in 1891. Not all Dubliners favoured demolition. Some businesses considered the pillar to be the city's focal point, and the tramway company petitioned for its retention as it marked the central tram terminus. In many ways, says Fallin, the pillar had become part of the fabric of the city. Kennedy writes, a familiar and very large if rather scruffy piece of the city's furniture, it was the pillar, Dublin's pillar rather than Nelson's pillar. It was also an outing, an experience. The Dublin sculptor John Hughes invited students at the Metropolitan School of Art to admire the elegance and dignity of Kirk's statue, and the beauty of the silhouette. In 1894 there were some significant alterations to the pillar's fabric. The original entry on the west side, whereby visitors entered the pedestal by a flight of steps taking them down below street level, was replaced by a new ground-level entrance on the south side, with a grand porch. The whole monument was surrounded by heavy iron railings. In the new century, despite the growing nationalism within Dublin, 80% of the corporation's councillors were nationalists of some description. The pillar was liberally decorated with flags and streamers to mark the 1905 Trafalgar centenary. The changing political atmosphere had long been signalled by the arrival in Sackville Street of further monuments, all celebrating distinctively Irish heroes, in what the historian Yvonne Whelan describes as defiance of the British government, a challenge in stone. Between the 1860s and 1911, Nelson was joined by monuments to Daniel O'Connell, William Smith O'Brien and Charles Stewart Parnell, as well as Sir John Gray and the temperance campaigner Father Matthew. Meanwhile, in 1861, after decades of construction, the Wellington Monument in Dublin's Phoenix Park was completed, the foundation stone having been laid in 1817. This vast obelisk, 220 feet high and 120 feet square at the base, honoured Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, Dublin-born and a former Chief Secretary for Ireland. Unlike the pillar, Wellington's obelisk has attracted little controversy and has not been the subject of physical attacks. On Easter Monday, the 24th of April 1916, units of the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army seized several prominent buildings and streets in central Dublin, including the General Post Office in Sackville Street, one of the buildings nearest the pillar. They set up headquarters at the GPO, where they declared an Irish Republic under a provisional government. One of the first recorded actions of the Easter Rising occurred near the pillar when lancers from the nearby Marlborough Street barracks, sent to investigate the disturbance, were fired on from the GPO. They withdrew in confusion, leaving 4 soldiers and 2 horses dead. During the days that followed, Sackville Street and particularly the area around the pillar became a battleground. According to some histories, insurgents attempted to blow up the pillar. The accounts are unconfirmed and were disputed by many that fought in the Rising, on the grounds that the pillar's large base provided them with useful cover as they moved to and from other rebel positions. By Thursday night, British artillery fire had set much of Sackville Street ablaze, but according to the writer Petrie de Rosa's account, on his pillar, Nelson surveyed it all serenely, as though he were lit up by 1,000 lamps. The statue was visible against the fiery backdrop from as far as Killarney, 9 miles away. By Saturday, when the provisional government finally surrendered, many of the Sackville Street buildings between the pillar and the levee had been destroyed or badly damaged, including the Imperial Hotel that Thackeray had admired. Of the GPO, only the facade remained. Against the tide of opinion, Bernard Shaw said the demolition of the city's classical architecture scarcely mattered. What does matter is the levee slums have not been demolished. An account in a New York newspaper reported that the pillar had been lost in the destruction of the street, but it had sustained only minor damage, chiefly bullet marks on the column and statue itself. One shot is said to have taken off Nelson's nose. In an independent Ireland, after the Anglo-Irish War of 1919–21 and the treaty that followed, Ireland was partitioned. Dublin became the capital of the Irish Free State, a dominion within the British Commonwealth of Nations. From December 1922, when the Free State was inaugurated, the pillar became an issue for the Irish rather than the British government. In 1923, when Sackville Street was again in ruins during the Irish Civil War, the Irish Builder and Engineer magazine called the original sighting of the pillar a blunder and asked for its removal, a view echoed by the Dublin Citizens Association. The poet William Butler Yeats, who had become a member of the Irish Senate, favoured its re-erection elsewhere, but thought it should not, as some wished, be destroyed, because the life and work of the people who built it are part of our tradition. Sackville Street was renamed O'Connell Street in 1924. The following year, the Dublin Metropolitan Police and the Dublin Civic Survey demanded legislation to allow the pillar's removal. Without success, pressure continued, and in 1926 the Manchester Guardian reported that the pillar was to be taken down, as it was a hindrance to modern traffic. Requests for action, removal, destruction of the replacement of the statue with that of an Irish hero, continued up to the Second World War and beyond. The main stumbling blocks remained the trustees' strict interpretation of the terms of the trust, and the unwillingness of successive Irish governments to take legislative action. In 1936, the magazine of the ultra-nationalist Blue Shirts movement remarked that this inactivity showed a failure in the national spirit. The conqueror is gone, but the scars which he left remain, and the victim will not even try to remove them. By 1949, the Irish Free State had evolved into the Republic of Ireland and left the British Commonwealth, but not all Irish opinion favoured the removal of the pillar. That year, the architectural historian John Harvey called it a grand work, and argued that without it, O'Connell Street would lose much of its vitality. Most of the pressure to get rid of it, he said, came from traffic maniacs who failed to visualize the chaos which would result from creating a through current of traffic at this point. In a 1955 radio broadcast, Thomas Bodkin, a former director of the National Gallery of Ireland, praised not only the monument but Nelson himself. He was a man of extraordinary gallantry. He lost his eye fighting bravely, and his arm in a similar fashion. On the 29th of October 1955, a group of 9 students from University College Dublin obtained keys from the pillar's custodian and locked themselves inside, with an assortment of equipment including flamethrowers. For the gallery they hung a poster of Kevin Barry, a Dublin Irish Republican Army volunteer executed by the British during the War of Independence. A crowd gathered below and began to sing the Irish rebel song, Kevin Barry. Eventually members of the Gardaí broke into the pillar and ended the demonstration. No action was taken against the students, whose principal purpose, the Gardaí claimed, was publicity. In 1956, members of the Fianna Fáil party, then in opposition, proposed that the statue be replaced by one of Robert Emmet, Protestant leader of an abortive rebellion in 1803. They thought that such a gesture might inspire Protestants in Northern Ireland to fight for a reunited Ireland. In the North, the possibility of dismantling and re-erecting the monument in Belfast was raised in the Stormont Parliament, but the initiative failed to gain the support of the Northern Ireland government. In 1959, a new Fianna Fáil government under Sean Lemass deferred the question of the pillar's removal on the grounds of cost. 5 years later, Lemass agreed to look at the question of replacing Nelson's statue with one of Patrick Pearse, the leader of the Easter Rising, in time for the 50th anniversary of the Rising in 1966. An offer from the Irish-born American trade union leader Mike Quill to finance the removal of the pillar was not taken up, and as the anniversary approached, Nelson remained in place.